Miles Carter moved into the rental on Maple Ridge Drive because it came with a fenced yard and a cheap monthly rate. The listing photos showed fresh grass, a small shed, and a big maple tree that would throw shade in summer. What they did not show was how the yard looked in early spring, when the snow had finally retreated and the ground began to breathe again. On Miles's first Saturday there, the air smelled like wet soil and thawing leaves. Birds argued in the branches. A neighbor jogged past with a bright windbreaker and a grin like winter had been defeated. Miles stepped onto the back patio with a mug of coffee and froze. Along the fence line, the grass was not just green. It was vivid, almost glossy, like it had been polished. Clumps of small yellow flowers had erupted overnight in a perfect arc, as if someone had planted them with a measuring tape. Near the shed, a patch of purple blooms formed a neat spiral. Miles liked gardening the way he liked cooking, enough to enjoy it, but not enough to obsess. Still, his eyes traced the patterns with growing confusion. He had not planted anything. He set the mug down and walked into the yard. The soil felt soft under his shoes, damp but springy. He crouched near the yellow flowers and touched a petal. It was warm, oddly warm, like the bloom was holding heat. A sound came from under the ground, a faint clicking, steady and purposeful. Miles leaned closer. The clicking stopped. He straightened quickly, scanning the yard. Nothing moved except the maple branches swaying in the breeze. He told himself it was bugs. The sort of hidden life spring woke up. He went inside, shut the back door, and tried to forget the patterns. The next morning, the yard had changed again. A new line of flowers ran from the patio steps toward the fence gate, a dotted trail of pale white blooms like breadcrumbs. Miles stared at them through the glass, a knot forming in his stomach. They did not look wild. They looked arranged. He grabbed his phone and texted the property manager, asking if the previous tenant had planted anything unusual. The reply came an hour later. No idea. Yard is tenant responsibility. Miles sighed and pulled on gloves. He fetched a small shovel from the shed and went to dig up the trail before it spread. The first flower came free with almost no resistance. The stem lifted, then the roots followed, and Miles felt his stomach twist. The roots were not delicate threads. They were thick and pale, like tiny fingers curled into the dirt. As the plant came up, those roots tightened around a small clump of soil, as if they were gripping it. Miles dropped the flower and stepped back, breathing hard. The roots twitched once, then went still. Miles stared at the plant on the ground, waiting for his brain to declare it a trick of light. It did not. The pale roots were curled around the dirt, like knuckles. He hurried inside and washed his hands for too long. That night, Miles woke to a soft sound outside. Tap, tap, tap. Not on the window. From below. Miles sat up in bed, listening. The tapping came from the wall by the headboard, low and slow, like something knocking from the foundation. He held his breath. Tap, tap, tap. Then the tapping moved, traveling along the wall toward the corner, fading into silence. Miles lay back down, eyes wide, until morning light finally seeped into the room. He called his neighbor across the street, a friendly guy named Brian Lambert who had introduced himself the day Miles moved in. Brian answered with a cheerful tone that faltered when Miles explained the flowers. "Oh, those," Brian said. "You got the blooming yard." Miles blinked. "The what?" Brian hesitated, as if choosing words. "It happens sometimes," he said. "Every few years. Folks move in, yard goes crazy, then they move out." "Why?" Brian exhaled. "People say the ground is rich. Like real rich. Too rich." Miles felt a chill. That is not an answer. Brian lowered his voice. "Look, man, I do not want to freak you out, but if the flowers start making shapes, do not follow them." Miles stared at his kitchen wall. "They already are." Brian went silent. Then he said softly, "Do not dig them up anymore. It makes it angry." Miles swallowed. "What makes it angry?" Brian did not answer. He muttered an excuse and hung up. That afternoon, Miles went to the backyard with a new plan. He would cover the flower patches with thick black tarp, starve them of sunlight, and call it done. He unfolded the tarp and dragged it toward the spiral of purple blooms near the shed. The yard smelled stronger now, sweet and sharp, like crushed stems. The clicking sound returned beneath his feet, louder, almost like a chorus. Miles spread the tarp over the spiral. The moment the tarp touched the flowers, the ground shuddered. It was subtle but real. A vibration passed up through Miles's shoes, making his ankles tingle. He stepped back quickly, heart pounding. The tarp bulged upward in one spot, as if something beneath it pressed from below. The bulge shifted, sliding along the tarp in a slow arc. Miles backed away toward the patio, eyes locked on the moving shape. The tarp lifted again, and this time he saw the outline, not of an animal, but of something long and branching, pushing like a hand under a blanket. A corner of the tarp flipped. Underneath, the flowers were gone. Not flattened, gone. In their place was bare soil, wet and dark, with pale roots exposed like veins. They were moving, flexing, and relaxing, slipping back into the earth. Miles stumbled inside and locked the back door. He stood in the kitchen, shaking, and heard the tap, tap, tap again. This time, at the back door itself, but not from outside, from the bottom of the door frame, as if something below the threshold was testing the wood. Miles grabbed his keys and drove to a hardware store. He bought bags of salt, a garden hoe, and 2 rolls of chicken wire. He did not have a plan beyond doing something, anything, that made him feel less helpless. When he returned, the yard looked normal again at first glance, spring green and harmless. Then Miles noticed the new blooms. They formed a ring around his back patio, a perfect circle of bright red flowers, each one facing inward, as if watching the door. Miles's throat tightened. He walked to the glass and stared down at the ring. The flowers did not sway in the wind. They were still. He poured salt along the patio edge, making a thick white line. Then he sprinkled it across the flower circle. The salt landed on petals and stems, sparkling briefly. The flowers wilted in seconds, not slowly, instantly, as if the life had been sucked out. Their petals curled inward, browning at the edges. A sour smell rose from them. Miles let out a shaky breath, relieved. Then the ground beneath the wilted ring cracked. A thin fissure opened in the soil, running along the circle Miles had salted. The crack widened, exposing a pale network beneath. Not roots like normal plants, but thick tendrils braided together like muscle. The tendrils pulsed. Miles stepped back, salt bag slipping in his hand. The tendrils moved toward the patio, pushing dirt aside, rising just enough to show themselves. They did not thrash. They reached, slow and deliberate, as if learning the shape of the world above. Miles slammed the back door and ran to the front of the house. He grabbed his phone and called the property manager, voice breaking as he demanded someone come immediately. The manager laughed nervously and said he would send a landscaper. A landscaper arrived an hour later, a young guy named Trevor Knox. He walked into the backyard, squinted at the ground, and shrugged. "Looks like you got some aggressive growth," he said. "Might be old fertilizer." Miles grabbed his arm. "It moves." Trevor rolled his eyes, then knelt by the crack. He poked the pale tendrils with a gloved finger. The tendrils tightened around his fingertip. Trevor yelped and jerked back, glove tearing. His bare finger was streaked with pale slime. He scrambled to his feet, face white. What the hell was that? Miles stepped back with him. "Told you." Trevor ran to his truck and came back with a metal spade. He raised it like a weapon and stabbed into the crack. The ground erupted. Not with dirt, but with flowers, shooting up in a burst of colors so fast it looked like a time lapse. Yellow, purple, red, white. Stems twisted around the spade, climbing it. Trevor shouted and dropped the tool, backing away. The flower stems surged toward him, wrapping around his boots. Trevor stumbled and fell. He kicked wildly, trying to free himself. The stems tightened, pulling him toward the crack. Miles grabbed Trevor's arms and dragged. Trevor screamed, boots scraping trenches in the mud. The stems clung, stretching like rubber. Miles hauled harder, muscles burning, and with a ripping snap, Trevor's boots came free, leaving the stems gripping empty leather. Trevor crawled backward across the yard in socks, eyes wide with terror. The crack in the ground widened slightly, and a warm breath of air rose from it, smelling like wet earth and something older. Miles yanked Trevor up and shoved him toward the house. They slammed the back door and locked it. Trevor stood in the kitchen shaking, staring at his socked feet, then at Miles. "I am leaving," Trevor whispered. "You should too." Miles nodded, unable to argue. They watched through the window as the backyard settled. The flower burst slowed, stems sinking back into the ground as if retreating. The crack closed gradually, the soil knitting itself together until it looked almost normal again. Almost. The red flower ring returned, reforming itself around the patio in a perfect circle, fresh and bright, as if nothing had happened. Trevor fled. Miles packed a bag. He stayed with his sister that night and called in sick the next day. Within a week, he was out of the rental. Lease broken, deposit lost, pride shredded. He did not care. He signed papers quickly, avoiding the property manager's eyes. A month later, on the first truly warm day of spring, Miles drove past Maple Ridge Drive out of a stubborn need to see. The yard looked peaceful from the street. Green grass, maple tree budding, a moving truck in the driveway. A new tenant, cheerful and unaware, carried boxes toward the front door. Miles did not stop. He kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, remembering the warmth of those pedals and the patient tapping beneath the floor. Spring had always meant growth to him. Now it meant something else entirely. Something hungry that learned your routines, shaped itself into patterns, and waited for you to step outside. The ice cracked beneath Daniel Foster's boots with a sound like a bone snapping. He froze at the edge of the pond, breath fogging the cool spring air. The snow had melted fast this year, retreating in dirty patches and swollen streams. The park was reopening early, paths cleared, benches dried, life returning after a long winter. Daniel had come for the quiet. The pond sat in a shallow bowl of trees just beyond the main trail, its surface half liquid, half skin. Dark water lapped softly against the remaining ice, slow and patient. A sign posted nearby warned visitors to stay back until the thaw finished. Daniel stepped closer anyway. He worked nights at the hospital as a maintenance tech, fixing lights and vents while everyone else slept. Spring meant exhaustion and relief mixed together. The world waking up while he felt hollowed out. He crouched and watched the ice shift. Something moved beneath the surface. Daniel leaned forward, squinting. It was probably a fish, stirred awake too early. Still, the movement felt wrong. It was slow and deliberate, tracing the underside of the ice like a finger following a crack. He straightened and stepped back as the ice creaked again. That was when he saw the shoe. It floated just below the surface near the shore, dark and heavy, the laces drifting like weeds. Daniel's stomach dropped. He scanned the water more carefully. There was more beneath it. A shape, pale and bloated, tangled in last year's reeds. Daniel stumbled back, heart hammering. He pulled out his phone and called it in, voice shaking as he gave the location. He waited on the trail, arms wrapped around himself, watching the pond like it might change its mind and hide the evidence. The police arrived with park staff. They cordoned off the area, murmured to each other, and confirmed what Daniel already knew: a body. The officer thanked Daniel and told him he could go. Daniel did, but the image followed him, burned behind his eyes, the way the water had seemed to cradle the body, like it was not ready to let go. Over the next week, the snow vanished completely. Grass pushed up everywhere, bright and insistent. Trees budded overnight. The city announced the pond would remain closed until further notice. Daniel kept thinking about it. He started dreaming of water. In the dreams, he stood at the edge of the pond while ice cracked open in long black lines. Hands reached up from beneath, brushing the surface, tapping gently from below. When he woke, his sheets were damp with sweat. One afternoon after a long shift, Daniel returned to the park without planning to. His feet carried him there, like a habit he did not remember forming. The caution tape was gone now. The sign still stood, but someone had scrawled over it with a marker. Open now. Daniel frowned and followed the path down. The pond was fully thawed, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the sky like a sheet of glass. Ducks drifted lazily near the center. Everything looked normal, too normal. Daniel walked the perimeter slowly. The reeds near the shore were pressed flat, as if something had been dragged out recently. He crouched and touched the mud. It was warm, almost pleasant. The water rippled. Daniel looked up. A disturbance spread outward from the center of the pond, a tight circle expanding slowly. The ducks scattered, flapping and squawking as they fled to the far bank. Something broke the surface. At first, Daniel thought it was a log. Then it rolled. A pale face surfaced, eyes half open, mouth slack. Water streamed from tangled hair as the body drifted closer to shore. Guided by a current Daniel could not see. Daniel staggered back, breath tearing out of him. His phone slipped from his hand and hit the dirt. The body did not stop. It slid onto the muddy bank with a wet sound and lay still, water pooling around it. The skin was gray and puckered, marked with dark veins. The chest rose once, then fell. Daniel screamed. The eyes snapped open. The man on the ground gasped violently, coughing water, fingers clawing at the mud. He rolled onto his side, retching, alive in a way that felt impossible. Daniel ran forward on instinct and stopped short, horror tangling with confusion. The man looked wrong. His limbs were stiff, movements jerky, like a puppet forced into motion. His skin was cold and slick, and where water ran off him, it left behind a faint trail of algae and silt. The man dragged himself upright, wobbling. "Help me," he croaked. Daniel took a step back. The man's eyes focused on him with sudden intensity. "You saw me first." Daniel shook his head, heart pounding. "Stay back. I am calling for help." The man smiled, lips stretching too wide. "I do not need help," he said. "I need warmth." He lunged. Daniel turned and ran, shoes slipping in the mud as he scrambled up the path. Behind him came the sound of wet footsteps, uneven but fast. Daniel burst onto the main trail, shouting for help. A jogger stopped, staring past him with confusion. The jogger's expression shifted to alarm. Daniel turned. The man from the pond stood at the trail's edge, water dripping onto the dirt. Sunlight glinted off his soaked clothes. Steam rose faintly from his skin. The jogger backed away slowly. "What happened to you?" The man tilted his head, listening, then took a step onto the trail. Where his foot touched the ground, the grass blackened, wilting instantly. Daniel grabbed the jogger's arm. "Run!" They ran together, breath ragged, feet pounding. Daniel glanced back once. The man followed, movements smoothing out with every step, as if the land itself was teaching him how to walk again. People began to scream as they saw him. A couple tried to help, reaching for him, and recoiled when his touch burned their skin like frostbite in reverse. The man laughed, a wet sound full of relief. "Spring is kind," he said. "It brings us back." Sirens wailed in the distance. The man staggered, suddenly unsteady. His steps slowed. Steam poured off him now, thick and white. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. "Too much," he murmured. "Too fast." His skin began to darken, cracking like drying mud. Water poured from his mouth as he dropped to his knees, coughing violently. The ground beneath him softened, turning slick. Daniel stopped a safe distance away, watching in horror as the man collapsed. His body slumped forward, dissolving into a slurry of mud, leaves, and black water that soaked into the earth. Within seconds, nothing remained but a dark stain on the trail. Police arrived moments later. Paramedics searched the area, confused by the reports, the burns, the melted patch of ground. They found no body, no footprints, no explanation. Daniel gave his statement, hands shaking. They listened politely. the way people do when they already know they will not write it down. A week later, the pond was drained. They found more bodies than anyone expected. Some recent, some decades old, preserved in the cold mud, waiting. The city filled the pond in by summer. Grass grew quickly over the dark soil, greener than anywhere else in the park. Daniel quit his job and moved away before spring ended. Even now, years later, when the weather warms too quickly and ice vanishes overnight, Daniel feels a tightness in his chest. He knows some things do not stay dead because they want to live. They come back because the ground remembers them. And spring is very good at remembering. Evan Brooks noticed the breathing before he noticed the leaves. He was walking the old bike trail behind his townhouse complex, earbuds in, hoodie unzipped to let in the mild spring air. Winter had finally loosened its grip, and the world felt tender and exposed, like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. Evan liked walking here in early spring because the trees were bare enough to see through, honest in a way summer never was. Halfway down the trail, he stopped. The sound was faint but rhythmic, a slow inhale and exhale that did not belong to him. Evan pulled out his earbuds and stood still. The trail was empty. No joggers, no cyclists, just trees and damp earth. The breathing continued. It came from the woods to his right, deep among the trunks. Evan frowned, telling himself it was wind moving through branches, but the timing was wrong. Too steady, too deliberate. He took a step closer to the edge of the trail. The ground there was darker than the rest, wet and churned like it had been disturbed recently. Small green shoots poked up through the soil, bright and fragile. Evan crouched and touched one. It felt warm. The breathing grew louder. Evan stood and backed away. His pulse ticked faster, an instinct he trusted more than reason. He turned and walked briskly back toward the complex, not running, not yet. Behind him, the breathing stopped. Spring surged forward over the next week. Trees budded overnight. Flowers burst through lawns and sidewalk cracks. The trail filled with people again. Evan told himself the breathing had been nothing. Then the trees changed. It started with the bark. Evan noticed it on his morning walk. A subtle rise and fall along the trunk of an oak near the trail entrance. He stopped and stared. The bark flexed inward, then outward, like a chest expanding. Evan stepped closer. The tree exhaled. A warm gust brushed his face, carrying the smell of damp leaves and something faintly sweet, like rot mixed with flowers. Evan stumbled back, heart racing. A jogger passed behind him, oblivious. "You see that?" Evan blurted. The jogger slowed and glanced at the tree, then at Evan. "See what?" Evan looked again. The bark was still. He laughed weakly and waved the jogger on, heat creeping up his neck. He stood there another minute, watching, but the tree did nothing. That night, Evan dreamed of roots. He dreamed he was underground, pressed between thick cords that pulsed around him. He could feel them breathing, slow and heavy. Each inhale tightened them. Each exhale loosened their grip. When he woke, his sheets were twisted around his legs like vines. The next day, the city posted notices along the trail. Temporary closure, due to ground instability. Evan ignored it. He returned in the afternoon, driven by a need he could not explain. Yellow tape fluttered between posts, but someone had already ducked under it. Evan followed, stepping onto the soft path. The woods felt different. Quieter, but not empty. The air was thick and warm, heavy in his lungs. The trees were in full leaf now, their canopies dense enough to block the sun. Evan realized with a jolt that spring had come too fast. He heard the breathing again. This time it was everywhere. The trunks around him rose and fell, bark shifting in subtle waves. Leaves trembled as branches flexed, not from wind but from effort. The forest inhaled together, a deep collective breath. Evan staggered back, panic blooming. "Stop," he whispered, unsure who he was talking to. The ground beneath his feet softened. He looked down to see the soil pulsing, lifting slightly with each breath. Small shoots burst upward, unfurling leaves in seconds. Flowers bloomed and withered in a blink, colors flashing and fading. Evan turned to run. The trail behind him had vanished. Trees stood where the path should have been, their trunks thick and close, bark still rippling. Evan ran anyway, pushing between branches that bent inward, resisting him. Leaves brushed his face, sticky with sap. He burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop. At the center stood a mound of earth, darker and richer than the surrounding soil. It rose and fell more dramatically than the rest, the breathing here loud and wet. Something moved beneath it. Evan backed away slowly. The mound split open. A hand emerged, coated in soil and fine roots. Fingers flexed, testing the air. Another hand followed. Then a head pushed up through the earth. It was a man, or had been. His skin was mottled green and brown. Patches of bark fused into his shoulders and neck. Leaves sprouted from his scalp like hair. His eyes opened, cloudy and unfocused. He inhaled sharply. The trees around them shuddered. The man looked at Evan and smiled, bits of soil crumbling from his lips. "Spring came early," he said, voice thick and damp. "We are so hungry." Evan shook his head, backing away. "What are you?" The man planted his hands and pulled himself farther out, roots snapping free from his legs with wet sounds. "We are what was planted," he said. "We are what stayed." Evan's heel caught on a root, and he fell hard onto his back. The ground was warm beneath him, almost welcoming. Thin roots brushed his wrists, his ankles, curious. He scrambled up and ran again, screaming now, voice tearing at his throat. The forest responded. Branches bent low, blocking his path. Vines snapped up from the soil, wrapping around his calves. Evan kicked free and stumbled onward, lungs burning. Ahead, he saw light. The edge of the woods. Evan surged forward, ripping through the last line of branches and tumbling onto the open grass of the complex lawn. He rolled and scrambled to his feet, spinning around. The woods stood still. The trees were just trees again. No movement, no breathing. Residents sat on benches, chatting. A child flew a kite. No one looked disturbed. Evan stood there, shaking, chest heaving. Behind him, at the edge of the woods, a single shoot pushed up through the soil and unfurled a bright green leaf. Evan moved out 2 days later. He broke his lease and slept on a friend's couch until he found a new place surrounded by concrete and brick. He avoided parks. He avoided trees. News articles surfaced weeks later about hikers who vanished near the trail. Officials blamed sinkholes and unstable ground from rapid thaw. The trail was permanently closed and eventually paved over. By summer, the grass there grew unnaturally thick and green. Evan tried to forget, but every spring, when the air warms too quickly and buds burst open overnight, Evan wakes with the same thought lodged in his chest. That some things do not grow to reach the sun. Some things grow to breathe again, and they remember who heard them first.